The night was too quiet for what was about to happen. The air felt still heavy, like it was holding its breath. A lone car eased into a quiet suburban driveway, clean streets, sleeping houses, porch lights glowing like tired eyes. Behind the wheel sat Senator Marcus Hale ***, his tie loosened, his eyes carrying the exhaustion of a 14-hour session in the state capitol. He wasn't just going home. He was finally stepping back into the one place where the world couldn't demand anything from him, or so he thought. Marcus opened his door slowly, stretching his stiff shoulders, reaching for his leather briefcase on the back seat. A long exhale, a moment of peace. Then peace ended. A police cruiser whipped around the corner, tires grinding against pavement as it jerked to a stop behind Marcus's car. The beams washed over him in stark white, turning his silhouette into something suspicious, dangerous, wrong. Officer Brent Riker stepped out, jaw clenched, posture rigid, eyes already full of assumptions. He didn't ask whose house this was, didn't ask why Marcus was here. He didn't see the tailored suit or the senator's lapel pin. He saw a black man by a car at night, and that was enough. "Step away from the vehicle," Riker barked. Marcus froze, palms open, calm voice steady. "Officer, this is." "Hands where I can see them." Marcus lifted them higher, the bitterness rising in his throat. Not again, not here, not after everything he'd fought for. Riker rushed forward, grabbing Marcus by the arm, slamming him against the hood. Metal dug into Marcus's ribs. Handcuffs snapped tight around his wrists, too tight, deliberately so. Across the street, blinds shifted. A neighbor watched. Another phone camera clicked on silently. Marcus tried to speak, to explain, but Riker didn't want explanations. He wanted control. "You're under arrest for attempted vehicle theft," he spat. Marcus closed his eyes, jaw trembling not with fear, but with the familiar, suffocating weight of injustice. What they didn't know would change everything. Morning light spilled softly through the Senate office windows, glinting off polished desks and walls lined with framed legislation. Senator Marcus Hale stood in the center of it all, adjusting his suit jacket as he prepared for another day in a life that demanded more than most men could carry. To the world, he looked like a rising star, eloquent, strategic, unshakably calm. But inside, Marcus carried a weight few could see. He grew up on the South Side, a neighborhood shaped by perseverance, where sirens often sang louder than lullabies. Raised by a single mother, Angela Hale, a schoolteacher who believed every child deserved dignity, Marcus learned early how the world treats black boys. With suspicion first, questions later. Angela raised him with two rules: never forget where you came from and never let this world make you small. But even as a grown man, even with credentials, influence, and respect, Marcus knew that a tailored suit couldn't shield him from prejudice. Last night's arrest was proof. Only hours earlier, he had been driving home after a grueling Senate debate, a session focused ironically on police accountability reform. The bill he sponsored aimed to strengthen oversight for officers with repeated misconduct complaints. It was a bill resisted fiercely by several law enforcement unions, and the opposition in the Senate chamber had been sharp, personal, and at times quietly venomous. Marcus felt those tensions long before stepping outside the Capitol's grand marble doors. Back in his office that morning, his legislative assistant, Jordan Pierce ***, a young political strategist with sharp instincts and an even sharper conscience, hovered with concern. He had heard whispers about a police incident involving Marcus but didn't know details yet. The way Marcus moved, slower, more cautious, unsettled him. Something had happened, something big. Jordan had been with Marcus since his campaign days. He knew Marcus's heart, his calm persistence, his unwillingness to strike back in anger even when attacked publicly. That emotional discipline had gotten Marcus elected, but Jordan often wondered how much of himself Marcus had to suppress to maintain that composure. Later that morning, Marcus sat in his office alone, fingers brushing the tender bruises on his wrist. They were minor physically, but emotionally they tore through layers of memory he thought he'd healed from. Encounters with police had marked his youth. Random stops, harsh tones, assumptions made before anyone bothered to ask his name. As a senator, he hoped he'd outgrown the vulnerability of those moments. Last night reminded him, no position, no title, no accomplishment makes a black man exempt from bias. And that realization cut deeper than the cuffs ever could. Meanwhile, Officer Brent Riker sat across the city in a dim break room at the precinct, pacing. A growing irritation twisted inside him, not remorse, but annoyance. He insisted to colleagues that he had done everything by the book. He claimed Marcus had been non-compliant, that his tone had been suspicious, that he had reasonable cause. But beneath Riker's rehearsed justifications was something uglier, a history of unaddressed aggression. Riker's personnel file was thick with complaints, unnecessary force, racial profiling, intimidation. Each complaint conveniently dismissed by superiors who valued loyalty to the badge over accountability. He operated in a system that didn't question him, a system that empowered him, that validated him, that protected him. Until now, because someone filmed it, something he didn't expect. A neighbor had recorded the arrest from behind partially closed blinds, capturing every action, every shove, every unjustified escalation. The video wasn't public yet, but rumors of its existence were already spreading quietly through the neighborhood. Across town, Marcus's wife, Naomi Hale, stood at the kitchen counter, staring at her phone screen as she replayed Marcus's brief call from the night before. His voice had been steady, but she could hear the tremor beneath it. Naomi had been married to him long enough to know when he was hurting, especially when he was trying to hide it. Naomi worked as a therapist, and she carried a different kind of strength, soft-spoken but fiercely protective of her family. She knew what people imagined when they thought state senator, power, privilege, insulation. But what they didn't see were the sleepless nights, the emotional bruising, the pressure to represent an entire community while navigating systems built to silence men like him. She wasn't afraid for Marcus's career. She was afraid for his heart. Meanwhile, the neighbor who filmed the scene, Mrs. Evelyn Moore ***, a retired history teacher who had lived on that street for 30 years, sat in her living room holding her phone. She had watched enough young lives broken by injustice to know silence was dangerous. Her hands trembled slightly as she replayed the footage. She didn't know whether she should send it to the news, the police department, or directly to Marcus's office. She just knew one thing: what she saw wasn't right. Back in the Senate office, Marcus finally gathered Jordan and Naomi in a closed meeting room. He recounted everything: the stop, the assumptions, the cuffs, the humiliation. Jordan listened with fists clenched. Naomi listened with eyes that didn't blink. Though Marcus delivered the story calmly, every word carried an undercurrent of something raw, the feeling of being reduced in an instant. Not as a senator, not as a leader, but as a stereotype, a target, a threat in the eyes of one man in uniform. It wasn't just an incident, it was a wound reopened. Naomi placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. Jordan leaned forward, asking the question Marcus feared most. "Do we go public?" Marcus didn't answer. Not yet. He knew the political storm that would follow: media frenzy, partisan attacks, attempts to twist the narrative. But he also knew the alternative. Staying quiet would mean allowing the system to justify Riker's behavior again. It would mean accepting the very injustice he was elected to fight. Just then, Jordan received a text notification. His eyes widened. He turned his phone toward Marcus. It was the video. Mrs. Moore had finally decided. Marcus watched the brief clip, Riker grabbing him, shoving him, cuffing him while Marcus tried to explain. He watched the officer disregard his calm tone, ignore his compliant posture, and escalate without reason. He watched himself not as a senator, but as a man stripped of dignity. And in that moment, the choice before him became clear. This wasn't just about his reputation. This wasn't about politics. This was about truth. This was about every mother who feared for her son's safety, every man who learned to lower his voice during traffic stops, every person taught to shrink themselves to survive. The injustice had touched a senator, but the story belonged to everyone who had no platform, no camera, no power. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight settle into clarity. He would not stay silent, not this time, not for anyone's comfort. And with that decision, the conflict began. The night air in the suburbs of Chicago felt unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that usually arrives after snowfall, except there had been no snow, only a humid summer haze. Ivan and Alina had been arguing in their bedroom for almost an hour, neither of them raising their voice, but both fighting in the exhausted, careful way of people who have fought too long. Ivan kept insisting she misunderstood everything, that she took every small mistake as a betrayal. Alina kept saying she felt alone in the same house as him. Each time she turned away from him, he felt a kind of panic, like he was losing something he hadn't appreciated enough when he still had it. By the time both fell silent, They were lying inches apart like strangers forced to share the same mattress. Ivan's eyes remained open for a long while, drifting over dim shapes in the ceiling. He had this creeping sensation of being watched, not by Alina, not by a person, but by something unseen. It was probably just guilt or exhaustion. He closed his eyes eventually, and the world receded into darkness. He woke to the metallic chirp of his phone alarm. For a moment he couldn't remember falling asleep. Damir's mosquito net swayed as if someone had touched it, though the window was shut. Nothing seemed out of place, no sound, no movement, yet the room felt wrong, as if an invisible pressure had settled over the walls. Ivan rubbed the feeling away, got dressed, and hurried to work with the police department. His shift dragged on with paperwork and a dull headache that hadn't been there the day before. He found himself rereading the same paragraphs, unable to focus. The air in the station felt too cold. Once he caught himself staring blankly at a screensaver, and his colleague had to nudge him back into awareness. He told himself he just needed more sleep, but something in him whispered that it wasn't tiredness. Something subtle was off inside him. By the time he drove home, the sun had dipped behind clouds, casting a bruised violet glow across the sky. He parked the car and felt a pulse of déjà vu, like he had returned from somewhere unfamiliar even though it had only been a normal shift. The house was quiet when he stepped inside. Damir was coloring cartoon animals at the dining table. Alina was chopping vegetables in the kitchen, her expression distant. Ivan bent down to kiss his son's hair, but Damir flinched slightly, not in fear, more like mild discomfort, as if he had felt a static shock. Ivan frowned and asked if he was okay. Damir nodded and went back to his drawing, though the child kept peeking at him with a puzzled expression, as if sensing something different. At first, dinner unfolded with a fragile calm, small talk, clinking plates, the normalcy of domestic routine. But beneath the surface, something felt stretched thin. Ivan's thoughts wandered like there was an echo of someone else inside them, faint but present. He found himself forgetting what Alina had asked seconds after she said it. He tried to smile, but the muscles in his face didn't match the emotion he intended. When dinner was over and Damir ran off to play, Ivan went upstairs to shower, hoping warm water would reset the haze clinging to him. As he stepped into the bathroom, the room's air felt denser than usual, humid in a way steam couldn't explain. His reflection in the mirror seemed slightly delayed, as if the glass needed a beat longer than reality to catch up. He started undressing but froze halfway when movement flickered at the edge of his vision. A shadow, no shape, no detail, just absence. He turned sharply, but nothing was there. The pipes hissed and clicked, the usual sounds of an old bathroom, yet the atmosphere felt charged like a storm building without thunder. He tried to dismiss it, but when he reached for the shower's faucet, his hand paused midair. Not because he hesitated, because it felt like something else hesitated through him. A split-second disconnect between his intention and his action. His fingers trembled before obeying the motion he wanted them to make, as if the body and the will weren't perfectly aligned. Ivan stared at his hand, bewildered. It didn't feel like his own for a moment. A cold ripple crawled beneath his skin, threading through his nerves. The feeling passed quickly, but left a tremor of unease behind. He turned on the water and stepped inside. Steam filled the shower, fogging the glass. The heat was grounding until it was. A sudden drop in temperature made him gasp. The water pouring from the showerhead shifted from warm to icy without transition. He twisted the knob urgently, but it didn't respond. It was stuck, immovable. The cold stung his skin sharply, making him feel flayed. The bathroom lights flickered, once, twice. He shut his eyes against the sting of freezing water, reaching blindly for the faucet. And then, there it was. A breath. Not his, not air, but the sensation of someone standing a hair's breadth behind him, exhaling slowly against the back of his neck. He spun around instantly, heart hammering, but the shower was empty. The lights steadied, the water turned warm again. Ivan stood still, chest heaving, staring at steam swirling like smoke. He wasn't the kind of man who panicked easily. Years in the police force had conditioned him to stay rational, grounded, but what was happening didn't fit rational categories. He took slow, steady breaths and told himself he had imagined it. He dried off, dressed, and went downstairs trying to shake the unease, but a subtle wrongness clung to him like static. Alina was in the living room folding laundry. She looked up when he entered, her eyes scanning his face with a sharpness that wasn't there earlier. "Are you okay?" she asked. He opened his mouth to say yes, but hesitated as a wave of dizziness hit him, brief, but strong enough to blur the room's edges. Elena set the laundry down, her expression shifting from concern to something bordering fear. "Ivan, your eyes look strange." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She moved closer, peering into his pupils like she was searching for something wrong behind them. "I don't know," she whispered, "just different." Damir emerged from the hallway holding his toy dinosaur, but the moment he saw Ivan, he slowed. His cheerful expression faltered. He clutched the toy to his chest and backed up a step. Ivan forced a soft smile. "What's wrong, buddy?" he asked, kneeling to his son's eye level. Damir didn't answer. Instead, he whispered something so quietly Elena barely heard it. "That's not Daddy." Ivan froze. The words sliced through him, raw and chilling, not because he believed them, but because they echoed the fear he himself couldn't name. Before he could ask Damir what he meant, the house's lights flickered again. Once, twice. A pulse of cold air swept through the living room, rustling the curtains though the windows were shut. Damir whimpered and hid behind Elena. Ivan felt a pressure bloom in his head, not painful but forceful, like someone pressing 2 fingers hard against his temples from inside his skull. He staggered slightly, and then he heard it. A sound with no mouth to utter it. A whisper curling through the back of his consciousness, threading itself through his thoughts with a voice that wasn't a voice at all. "You are opened." Ivan staggered again, and everything shifted. The world seemed to tilt, not physically but perceptually, as if a lens had slipped over Ivan's senses. The living room blurred at the edges while sounds stretched and warped. Elena's voice reached him through a thickening haze, her words indistinguishable yet weighted with panic. He blinked hard to steady himself, but the moment he closed his eyes, darkness didn't appear. Instead, something else filled the void. Flashes of shapes, silhouettes, impossible geometry twisting into patterns he didn't recognize. It lasted only an instant, and then he was back in his living room, breath unsteady, palms clammy. Elena stepped forward to steady him, but flinched when her fingers made contact with his arm. She recoiled as if she'd touched a freezing metal pole in winter. Ivan instinctively backed away, lifting his hands in confusion, in surrender, as if he needed to show her he wasn't a threat. "I don't know what's happening," he said, voice shaking despite his effort to stabilize it. Elena shook her head frantically and reached for her phone. "I'm calling someone, a doctor, anyone." Before she could dial, the house lights flickered again, harder this time. A rapid strobe. Damir screamed and covered his ears. Ivan's vision pixelated around the edges, like static creeping inward. The buzzing in his skull intensified, swelling like a swarm of insects humming just under the surface of his consciousness. Then everything went black. Not darkness. Absence. A blankness so complete he wasn't even sure he was standing on the floor anymore. Silence pressed around him, thick and suffocating, broken only by a rhythmic pulse that didn't feel like a heartbeat but something manufactured, synthetic, alien. He called out for Elena, for Damir, but his voice didn't echo. It didn't even sound like his own. The space swallowed every syllable whole. A flicker, then another, and light surged around him, not the warm glow of a lamp, but sterile illumination like an operating room. Ivan shielded his eyes, but when he opened them again, the living room was gone. He stood in a place with no walls, no ceiling, just a vast emptiness stretching infinitely in all directions. His feet hovered inches above the ground, though he couldn't see what held him up. It felt like floating, but with gravity still clinging to his bones. Shapes materialized around him, outlines of pillars, gradually forming into structures made of something that looked metallic but moved like water. The surfaces shimmered with colors his mind struggled to name, shifting in impossible ways, like reflections that didn't obey physics or perspective. Ivan wanted to move, to back away, to scream, but his body refused to obey. He was frozen, paralyzed not by fear but by something external, an invisible force pinning him in place as if he were being scanned. A low hum vibrated through the space. It wrapped around him, threaded through him, pressing into his bones. His vision wavered, and suddenly he saw images, not images, memories, but not his own. At least not entirely. The flashes came rapid fire. A starless sky torn open by a fracture of light. Figures moving in an environment that wasn't Earth. Translucent, elongated, limbs like streams of fluid wrapped around thin cores of luminous veins. Objects shaped like spirals within spirals, rotating in synchronized patterns. A massive structure floating above a gas giant, pulsing with energy like a heartbeat. A cluster of beings gathered around something glowing bright white, their forms shifting like shadows stretched by fire. Then, a face, not human, not monstrous, simply incomprehensible, eyes that weren't eyes, a mouth that wasn't a mouth, a geometry that seemed to rearrange itself each time he tried to focus. It leaned closer, and the air around him compressed, making it hard to breathe. A voice cut through the static, not spoken through sound waves, but directly into his mind. "You are receptive." The voice repeated, layering over itself like echoes collapsing inward. "You are opened." Ivan tried to speak, to demand answers, but every attempt dissolved into silence. Panic surged through him, but even that emotion felt suspended, held at arm's length by some anesthetic presence inside his nervous system. The being moved closer, then suddenly split into multiple versions of itself, each slightly shifted in space, like he was seeing overlapping dimensions. They surrounded him, studying him with an intensity that felt clinical yet strangely curious. More images flashed. A planet engulfed in shimmering blue flames. A child laughing under a sky with 3 moons. Bodies floating weightless inside a chamber filled with drifting lights. A city built vertically into the side of a canyon, illuminated by glowing filaments. A figure kneeling beside an orb that pulsed with the same frequency he felt in his skull now. He felt something probe the back of his mind, gentle but invasive, like fingers rummaging through memories. He saw himself as a boy on the beach with his father. He saw Alina laughing on their wedding day. He saw Damir being born, his tiny fingers curling around his thumb. He felt these memories being examined, rotated, held up to some invisible criteria he couldn't understand. He tried to resist, to push back, to reclaim ownership over his own mind. A sharp pain cracked through his skull like lightning. His vision fractured. He screamed, but no sound came out. The emptiness shattered into shards of white light. And then he was back, standing in the living room. Or at least a version of it. Everything looked slightly off-kilter, colors too bright, shadows too sharp. Alina was frozen mid-step, phone in hand, her eyes wide with horror. Damir was clutching her leg, staring at Ivan like he was staring at a stranger wearing his father's face. The lights flickered violently, then stabilized. Ivan gasped and fell to his knees. Sweat drenched his face. His lungs struggled to inflate. Alina rushed forward but stopped short, hovering inches away as if unsure whether touching him might burn her again. "What happened, Ivan, what happened?" she pleaded, her voice cracking. He opened his mouth, but words failed. His throat felt like it had swallowed electricity. He braced himself on his hands, but one of them trembled uncontrollably, shaking so violently he couldn't stop it. I do," he swallowed hard. "I think I passed out." Alina shook her head. "No, you weren't unconscious. You were staring at the ceiling, but not blinking, not moving. Your eyes were different." Damir whimpered again, whispering, "That's not Daddy," as he buried his face in her shirt. Ivan felt a rush of dread. He looked down at his hands. The skin looked normal, but something pulsed beneath it, a faint vibration, like a current moving through him. He pressed his fingers against his forearm, and for a moment it didn't feel like his own flesh. It felt denser, heavier, like something layered within it. He tried to stand, but dizziness hit him so hard the room spun. Alina grabbed his elbow instinctively, wincing at how cold his skin felt. "I'm calling an ambulance," she said. "No," he rasped. "No hospitals." She stared at him, incredulous. "You need help." He shook his head weakly. "Whatever this is, they can't fix it." The buzzing in his skull intensified again, this time paired with a pressure behind his eyes. His vision blurred as if someone was adjusting a dial inside his head. And then he saw them. 2 faint silhouettes standing behind Alina, tall, thin, their outlines flickering like heat waves. Their limbs shimmered, their heads elongated. They had no faces, yet he felt their attention sharpen on him. Ivan blinked hard, but the figures didn't disappear. They were real. Or at least real to him. One of them tilted its head, and an electric pulse shot through his body. He gasped and clutched his chest. The room dimmed, sounds muffling again. "Ivan," Alina's voice sounded miles away. "Talk to me." "I think," he choked, struggling to form a coherent thought as the silhouettes moved closer. "I think they're still here." Elena followed his gaze, but saw nothing. "Ivan, you're scaring me. Please, what do you see?" He lifted a trembling hand and pointed behind her. Elena turned slowly. "Nothing. Just the dining table, just the hallway, just the mundane comforts of their home." But to Ivan, the figures stood motionless, observing him with an otherworldly patience. One of them extended an arm, and a ripple of distortion traveled through the air like a heat mirage. Ivan recoiled. "Stay back," he whispered. Elena looked at him like he had lost his mind, and maybe he had. Maybe whatever had happened had ripped something loose inside him, peeled apart the barriers between perception and hallucination. The silhouette closest to him raised its hand again, and suddenly images exploded in Ivan's mind. Rapid flashes, not memories but warnings. A structure buried beneath ice. A chamber filled with suspended bodies. A creature crawling from a pool of light. A spaceship descending through a storm. A hand reaching out to him, his own hand, but not the version attached to the body he inhabited now. Ivan screamed. The living room shattered into white. He collapsed, and everything went silent. Minutes or hours passed before awareness seeped back in. He was lying on his side, the carpet rough under his cheek. Elena was kneeling beside him, sobbing, begging him to respond. Damir stood behind her, gripping her shoulder with tiny, trembling fingers. Ivan opened his eyes slowly, and the first thing he saw was his reflection, distorted in the glossy surface of the television screen. His pupils were normal, but behind them, layered like a faint afterimage, something shimmered. Something alive. He exhaled shakily and whispered, "They did something to me." Elena froze. "What do you mean?" she asked, stepping back. Ivan lifted a trembling hand, pressing it to his chest. "I wasn't dreaming," he said. "I wasn't hallucinating." He swallowed hard. "I think they changed something inside me." Ivan didn't sleep that night. He tried, God knows he tried, but every time he closed his eyes, the world behind his eyelids exploded in a blinding tapestry of symbols and images that weren't his. Shapes spiraled into each other, collapsing and reforming, as if some part of the universe were trying to express itself through him. He'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat, pulse pounding like he'd been running for miles. Elena stayed in the bedroom with Damir, though she left the door cracked open. Not fully shut, not fully open. A compromise born of fear. She loved him. She repeated those words a dozen times, but her hands trembled every time she said his name. Her eyes kept darting to his face, searching for something familiar. Ivan couldn't blame her. Even he wasn't sure who he was anymore. At dawn, when gray light softened the edges of the world, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror. His reflection stared back, same jawline, same cheekbones, same worn lines from years of worry and work. But something was undeniably different. His pupils seemed to hold a depth that wasn't human, almost like a second layer of movement deep behind them, flickering faintly when he focused too hard. He leaned closer. For a split second, the mirror rippled. Like water. Like a screen with a glitch. He stumbled back, breath catching in his chest. His heart hammered, each beat sending a weird vibration through his arms, like tiny shocks firing inside his veins. He gripped the sink until his knuckles whitened. "No hospitals," he whispered to himself, replaying his own words from last night. "No doctors, no one can know." Not yet, not until he understood what had been done to him. The silhouettes from before flickered faintly in the corner of the bathroom, again like heat waves, like optical distortions. He refused to look directly at them. When he did, the images in his head surged and he felt that pressure behind his eyes, but he could sense their presence, watching, waiting. Ivan splashed cold water on his face. It helped at least for a moment. He had to get out of the house. He needed air. He needed answers. By the time Elena stepped into the kitchen, Ivan was already dressed, hands shoved into his pockets to hide the trembling. "You're leaving?" she asked, voice soft, cautious. "Just for a while, I need to clear my head." He didn't meet her eyes. Elena's breath hitched. She wasn't the kind of woman who panicked easily, but the last 12 hours had stretched her spirit thin. "Ivan, you collapsed. You were," her voice faltered. "You weren't breathing for a moment." "I'm okay now." It was a lie and she knew it. But she didn't stop him. She only whispered, "Come back." And when Damir peeked at him from behind her, eyes wide, uncertain, Ivan felt a stab of guilt so sharp he almost turned around and stayed. Almost, but something else tugged at him. A pull he couldn't name, something urging him outward, away from the familiar, away from the safety of home. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a compulsion, more like alignment. As if the universe had shifted slightly and he was now sliding toward a place he was meant to be. He stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and cool, but it didn't feel cold to him, not on his skin. It felt neutral, almost temperatureless. He walked down the street trying to keep his breathing steady. Every sound seemed amplified. The chirp of birds vibrated in his chest. The rattle of a passing bus felt like it echoed through the pavement into his bones. He could hear things at distances he shouldn't, conversations behind closed windows, the hum of an electrical box half a block away. He stopped, pressing his fingers to his temples. This wasn't normal. None of it was normal. The silhouettes appeared again, this time on both sides of the sidewalk. Flickering faintly, humanoid but stretched, as though their forms were too tall to fit into the world correctly. Ivan shut his eyes, shaking his head as if he could dislodge them. "Go away," he muttered, barely audible. When he opened his eyes, they were gone. Or hiding again. He kept walking. A block later, something in the distance caught his attention. Not visually, not audibly, but internally, like a tug in the center of his mind. His feet turned on their own, guiding him toward the old industrial part of town. The abandoned warehouses loomed in the distance, their windows boarded, their metal siding rusted. Why here? He didn't know, but he knew this was where he needed to be. As he approached the largest warehouse, a tremor rippled through him. His vision blurred, then sharpened. The air seemed to hum with the same frequency he felt in the back of his skull. He reached the side door padlocked, chained heavily. The moment he touched the lock, a jolt surged through his arm. The chain snapped open as if the metal had simply given up, crumbling like brittle wire. Ivan stumbled back in shock. He swallowed. I didn't do that. But he had. Somehow. He pushed the door open, heart pounding. The inside was dark, dust swirling through pale beams of morning light that slipped through cracks in the roof. It smelled of rust and damp concrete. Ivan moved deeper, feet crunching over debris. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. But he found it anyway. At the center of the warehouse sat an object, something that didn't belong. It hadn't been there the last time he'd passed by this place years ago. It wasn't a machine, but it wasn't natural either. A circular metallic structure stood upright, taller than a man, etched with glowing lines that pulsed faintly, perfectly synchronized with the vibrations in Ivan's skull. When he stepped closer, the pulse quickened, matching the frantic rhythm of his heart. His breath came shallow, his palms tingled. The air around the structure seemed thicker, as if gravity had pooled unevenly. And then the silhouettes materialized, clearer than ever before. There were 3 of them now. Their bodies translucent, almost fluid. Their movements slow, deliberate. They didn't walk, they glided. Ivan froze. One of them raised an arm, and the object at the center responded. The glowing lines brightened, spiraling inward like a living circuit. The being turned its faceless head toward Ivan, and a surge of memories, not his, washed over him like a tidal wave. A planet on fire. A ship fleeing. A chamber filled with sleeping bodies. A device identical to the one in front of him, buried beneath snow and ice. A cry for help. A warning. A last attempt at survival. Ivan staggered backward as the images faded. He whispered, "Why me?" No voice answered. But the pressure in his skull pulsed once, intentional, almost like a response. Not random. Not accidental. Chosen. He felt his knees weaken. This thing, this presence inside him, these beings. They had done something to him. Changed him. And now they were calling him back. He took an unsteady breath, gripping his chest. His heart fluttered strangely, not painfully, but like it was syncing with some external rhythm. He reached toward the structure. His fingertips hovered centimeters away. The pulsing intensified. A faint voice, not spoken, slipped into his consciousness. Aligned. Ivan recoiled as if burned. No, his voice echoed, raw and desperate. I'm human, I'm not whatever this is. The silhouettes flickered, and for the first time their forms wavered, unstable, as if reacting to his resistance. Something cracked overhead, and a chunk of rusted metal clanged onto the floor behind him, startling him back a step. His vision blurred again, static creeping across his peripheral. His lungs seized. He collapsed to one knee, panting, trembling violently. The being stepped closer. Ivan fought the rising wave of darkness threatening to pull him under. He wasn't ready. He didn't understand. He didn't want this. He forced himself to stand, stumbling backward toward the door. He didn't break eye contact with the structure until he was outside, slamming the door behind him. His entire body shook. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. He felt like he had been plugged into a generator and then ripped out too fast. Ivan staggered down the street until he reached his car. His hands trembled as he unlocked the door. Once inside, he gripped the steering wheel so tightly his fingers ached. Whatever was happening, it was escalating. He needed help, not a doctor, not a hospital. Someone who could understand anomalies. Someone who had dealt with inexplicable events. He thought of one name. Professor Darian Kalvak, a reclusive astrophysicist who'd been forced into early retirement after publishing theories about non-human intelligence interacting with Earth for thousands of years. The academic community laughed at him. His funding evaporated. He vanished into obscurity. But Ivan remembered him, because 11 years ago, Kalvak had been his physics professor. And he had once told Ivan something in private, after a lecture most students mocked. Human perception is a cage, something out there is rattling the bars. One day someone will hear it, and when they do, it'll change everything. That day had come. Ivan needed him. He started the car. The silhouettes flickered in the rearview mirror. He blinked. They were gone. He pulled onto the road. Whatever awaited him next, it was bigger than fear. And it was already inside him. The highway stretched ahead like a gray ribbon disappearing into the horizon. Ivan drove with both hands locked on the wheel, knuckles bone-white, jaw clenched so tight it ached. Every few minutes, another wave of dizziness washed over him. The world would blur in soft pulses, then snap back into focus. It felt like something inside his brain was adjusting itself, shifting gears, syncing with something he still couldn't name. Cars passed him on either side, their engines a little too loud, their headlights a little too bright. Every sensory detail felt magnified, like the world had been sharpened to a dangerous edge. At one point, he heard a conversation happening 2 lanes over, 2 strangers arguing about gas prices. He shouldn't have been able to hear that, not through closed windows, not over the engine noise. He turned up the radio just to drown it out, but the speakers crackled with static the moment his fingers touched the dial. A high-pitched hum filled the cabin, vibrating through the seats, the dashboard, straight into his bones. The radio fizzled and died. Ivan exhaled shakily. Great, that's new. He glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing unusual this time. No silhouettes. No impossible shapes fluttering at the edges. But the absence didn't comfort him. It made his nerves tighten further, as if the quiet meant the storm was gathering. 40 minutes later, he pulled off the main highway and followed a winding road lined with pine trees. The deeper he drove, the more isolated the landscape became. Old rural houses sat far apart, their roofs sagging under years of neglect. A rusted bus stop shelter leaned sideways at the edge of the road, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. Eventually, the GPS app on his phone announced his turn, though the screen flickered with interference the whole time, like it struggled to interpret the location. Professor Darian Kalvak's home sat at the end of a narrow gravel path. A modest cottage wooden siding grayed by time, roof patched with mismatched shingles. No car in the driveway, curtains drawn. A wind chime made from mismatched metal pieces clinked softly on the porch. Ivan swallowed hard. This was it. The man who might be the only person capable of understanding what had happened inside that warehouse, what had happened inside his mind. He stepped out of the car slowly, the gravel crunching under his feet. The air felt colder around the cottage, too cold for the season. The hairs on his arms rose. He walked to the porch and knocked on the door. Silence. He knocked again, louder. After several seconds, a metallic scraping sound echoed from within, locks unbolting, one after another after another. The door cracked open 2 inches. A single eye peered through the gap, pale blue, sharp, suspicious. "You," the voice rasped. "I remember your face." Ivan blinked, startled. He hadn't expected that. The door opened wider, revealing Professor Kovac. Older now, hair unkempt and mostly white, beard tangled, sweater worn thin. He looked like a man who hadn't seen daylight in weeks, maybe months. "Ivan Blazevik," the professor said slowly. "Years, it's been years." He didn't say it warmly. His tone was wary, as if Ivan arriving here could only mean one thing: trouble. Ivan swallowed. "I need your help." Kovac stepped aside without another word. Not an invitation, more like resignation. Inside, the living room was cluttered with stacks of books, papers, strange instruments, metallic fragments, and diagrams taped to the walls. Compasses, oscilloscopes, electromagnetic meters, star maps. It looked less like a home and more like a bunker built by someone who expected the world to end at any moment and planned to document the final seconds. The professor motioned toward a chair, but Ivan remained standing. "What happened to you?" Kovac asked, studying him like a specimen under a microscope. Ivan hesitated. He didn't know where to begin. Words felt too small for what he had seen, what he had felt. Finally, he said, "I had an encounter." Kovac didn't blink. "Describe it." Ivan inhaled, steadying himself. "I saw something, someone. They weren't human." Still no reaction. "They showed me things, places, images I didn't understand, and then I woke up in my home, but something was different. I was different." Kovac's gaze sharpened. He stepped closer, examining Ivan's face with unsettling intensity. "Let me see your eyes." Ivan leaned forward. The professor hissed softly between his teeth, as if confirming a suspicion. "What?" Ivan stiffened. "What do you see?" "A resonance, a shimmer behind the iris." Kovac backed away. "How long since the encounter?" "Last night." The professor muttered something in another language, Croatian maybe, pacing back and forth, rubbing his temples. "They chose you. Why would they choose you?" "I didn't choose any of it," Ivan snapped, voice rising. "I didn't ask for this, I didn't want this, I just want my life back." Kovac froze. "There is no going back." Ivan's stomach dropped. The professor pointed to a diagram on the wall, concentric circles overlapping with star systems. "There are entities far more advanced than us. Some communicate, some observe, but only one is known, rumored, to integrate." "Integrate?" Ivan repeated, feeling the word scrape against his nerves. Kovac nodded grimly. "They don't just contact, they imprint, they merge information, knowledge, sometimes consciousness. The host changes, slowly, irreversibly." Ivan's mouth went dry. "You're saying they're inside me." "I'm saying," the professor corrected, "that your mind is no longer an isolated system." Ivan felt the room tilt. He gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. Kovac watched him. "Tell me everything." Ivan tried. He described the silhouettes, the warehouse, the metallic structure, the visions of alien worlds, the overwhelming sense of being examined, evaluated, the pulses in his skull, the crackling radio, the strange strength he'd used to break the metal lock. Kovac listened silently, absorbing every detail with unnerving focus. When Ivan finished, the room fell into a tense, heavy quiet. Finally, the professor whispered, "You activated something." Ivan frowned. "I didn't activate anything." Kovac shook his head. "Not consciously, but your proximity to that device, the resonance between your neural pathways and their technology, triggered a link." "A link to what?" "To them." Ivan's breath caught. "They're still watching me." "That much is obvious." "Why me?" His voice cracked, raw and desperate. "Why not someone smarter, someone stronger, someone who actually wants this?" Kovac didn't answer immediately. He began rummaging through a stack of folders and pulled out a thin metal case. Inside were several pages filled with diagrams and notes. He flipped to one and placed it on the table. Ivan stared. The drawing depicted a human silhouette surrounded by energy fields, pathways branching out from the brain like luminescent roots. "What is this?" Ivan asked. "A theoretical model," Kovac said softly. "A human capable of interfacing with non-human thought matrices, a bridge between species." "A bridge," Ivan repeated, the word tasting like iron in his mouth. Kovac nodded. "Someone who can receive and eventually transmit." Ivan felt his pulse quicken. Transmit what? Information, memory, commands, communication. Panic surged in Ivan's chest. No, no, I can't, I'm not. You are, the professor interrupted sharply. You already have been chosen. Ivan stepped back, shaking his head. I'm not anyone special. Kovac's gaze softened slightly. In my experience, that is exactly the kind of person they choose. Ivan felt a surge of nausea. He stumbled toward the wall, bracing himself with one hand. The vibrations in his skull grew stronger. He heard a faint murmuring, like distant whispers layered over each other, too faint to understand. He pressed his palms to his temples. They're here, he gasped, inside my head right now. Kovac stepped back, anxiety flickering through his eyes. Ivan, listen. If they're trying to connect again, you must fight it. Focus on grounding yourself. Remember who you are, your name, your family, your memories. Hold on to them with everything you have. Ivan squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to breathe. Ivan Blazevik, he whispered. Husband, father, son. The whispers intensified, swirling into a single tone, high-pitched, invasive, electric. His knees buckled. Kovac grabbed his arm, struggling to support him. Ivan, the professor shouted, shaking him, stay with me. But the world dimmed. The silhouettes appeared in the corners of the room, flickering, watching. One stepped closer, its elongated form hovering inches above the floor. A surge of alien images slammed into Ivan's consciousness like a floodgate bursting open. Stars collapsing, vessels drifting through dark space, organisms shaped like spirals of light. A planet cracked open like an egg. A cry that wasn't a sound, but a vibration of grief. And then, his own face reflected in a surface not made of glass. But his reflection blinked on its own. Independent, separate, another him. Watching, waiting. Ivan screamed. His knees hit the floor. His vision fractured into shards of brightness and shadow. Kovac shook him harder. Ivan, what are they showing you? Ivan's voice broke as he choked out, something is coming. What? They're afraid, Ivan rasped. They're not here to hurt me. They're here because something worse is coming. The silhouettes flickered violently, glitching like corrupted data. The visions overwhelmed him, rushing, colliding, merging into a single impossible truth he couldn't fully grasp. Something approaching Earth. Not a being. Not a ship. A phenomenon. A collapse. A hunger. A force. It had already consumed worlds. And now it was coming here. Ivan's breathing grew ragged. They didn't change me to control me, he whispered, tears streaking down his face. They changed me to warn you. Kovac froze. For the first time, true fear cracked through the old man's eyes. What did they say? He whispered. Ivan looked up, trembling uncontrollably. They said we don't have time. The courtroom felt colder than usual, like the air itself was bracing for impact. Rows of spectators leaned forward in tense silence. Reporters tapped quietly on laptops, eyes sharp with expectation. Every seat was filled, every corridor packed. This wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. It had become a symbol, a clash between truth and the kind of power people pretend doesn't exist. Senator Marcus Hale sat at the plaintiff's table, back straight, face composed, hands curled around a pen he hadn't written a single note with. Despite the pressure, he moved with the quiet dignity he always had, but there was an edge beneath it now. A simmering resolve. The kind a man only grows after being humiliated in front of his own home. His lawyer, Jordan Vance, whispered, "Today is the day everything shifts. You ready?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked across the room at Officer Brent Riker, uniform pressed, expression carved from cold stone. Riker kept his chin up, but his jaw twitched every few seconds, pride fighting panic. His department had backed him publicly at first, but as more footage surfaced, that support faded into polite distance. Marcus finally replied, "I've been ready since the night he put his hands on me." The judge entered and the room rose. When everyone settled, the defense attorney called their final witness, Officer Riker himself. He walked to the stand, shoulders squared, but his steps betrayed something, a stiffness, like he was carrying the weight of a truth he wasn't built to hold. The oath was read. He raised his hand, sat down. The defense attorney began softly, trying to paint him as a man who simply misjudged a tense situation. What made you believe Senator Hale was committing a crime? Riker cleared his throat. He matched the description of a suspect reported in the area: dark clothing, late hour, suspicious behavior. Jordan Vance stood sharply. Objection, there was no such report on dispatch the entire night. The judge nodded, sustained. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, realizing this was not the battlefield he wanted. But the moment everyone was waiting for came, when Jordan rose for cross-examination. He didn't walk toward Riker immediately. He took slow, deliberate steps, like a man approaching a locked door he knew he could break open with one good strike. "Officer Riker," Jordan began, "how many years have you been on the force?" 12, Riker replied. 12 years, and in those 12 years you've received 8 complaints for racial profiling, correct? Riker tensed. Those were unsubstantiated. But they existed. Silence stretched. Yes, Riker admitted. Jordan tapped a finger on the rail. Now let's talk about the night you arrested Senator Hale. You saw a black man in a driveway, and instead of asking a single question, you escalated. You cuffed him. You shoved him against his car. You accused him of stealing his own vehicle. Riker's nostrils flared. He didn't identify himself. He tried, Jordan shot back. The footage shows his mouth open before you reached him. The courtroom buzzed. The judge banged the gavel. Jordan leaned in just slightly. Tell us, officer, why were you so determined to see a criminal where there wasn't one? Riker swallowed hard. I was doing my job. Jordan unfolded a paper. This is your own report. You wrote that Senator Hale was aggressive. Tell the court what he did that was aggressive. Riker's lips parted, but no answer came. The video, played earlier, had shown nothing but compliance. Jordan didn't let him breathe. Was it aggressive when he raised both hands? Was it aggressive when he said, "Officer, this is my home"? Was it aggressive when he told you his wallet was in his back pocket? Riker's silence confessed everything. Jordan stepped back, voice rising, not loud, but powerful enough to fill the space. Officer, the only threat that night was the one you imagined, the one you projected onto him. Riker clenched the edge of the witness stand. His facade was cracking. And that, Jordan said softly, is why we're here. Marcus watched, chest rising and falling with restrained emotion. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was truth being pulled into daylight. Jordan returned to his table. The defense hurried through a redirect, but the damage was done. The truth, undeniable, heavy, hung in the air like a storm cloud finally ready to burst. Then came the final moment, closing arguments. Jordan walked to the center of the courtroom. No notes, no theatrics, just a man carrying a truth the world needed to hear. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I want you to picture something. A man finishes the hardest day of his career. He's fought for education funding, for safer neighborhoods, for police reform. He's exhausted, worn down, but proud. He drives home. And right when he thinks he's safe, the system he's trying to improve treats him like an enemy. He paused, letting the image settle. Now imagine that man isn't a senator. Imagine he's your neighbor, your brother, your son. Several jurors shifted. Because what happened to Senator Hale isn't rare. It isn't accidental. It isn't a misunderstanding. It's a pattern. One that costs innocent black men their dignity, their safety, and sometimes their lives. Riker looked away. Senator Hale complied. He stayed calm. He did everything we teach our young black boys to do when confronted by an officer. And still, he was treated as guilty first, human second. Jordan turned toward the jury fully. This case isn't about money. It's about accountability. It's about saying that a uniform is not a shield for misconduct. That authority is not a license for bias. If this can happen to a state senator, what chance does the average black man have? He stepped back, voice dropping to a near whisper. Today, you decide whether this story becomes another tragedy swept under the rug or a turning point. He sat down. The defense delivered its own argument, but it landed weakly, hollow next to the weight of what had been shown. The jury left the courtroom. Minutes stretched into an hour, then another. Marcus sat still, hands folded tightly, his mother gripping his shoulder, whispering prayers under her breath. Finally, the courtroom doors opened. The jurors filed in, expressions serious, eyes forward. The foreman stood. In the case of Hale versus Riker and the Westbridge Police Department, the entire room leaned forward. We find the defendant liable. Marcus closed his eyes. His mother gasped softly. Jordan exhaled for the first time in hours. The foreman continued. We award the plaintiff $3.5 million in damages. It felt like the air cracked open. A wave of emotion surged through the courtroom. Some people clapped before the judge banged the gavel for order. Riker collapsed into his chair, face pale, breath shaking, the reality of consequences finally landing. But Marcus didn't celebrate, not yet. He stood slowly, looking at the jury with gratitude, then at Riker with a steady, human gaze. He didn't see victory. He saw the cost of a system broken long before this night. As he stepped outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted, crowds chanted his name. But he paused at the top of the steps, letting the sunlight wash over him. This wasn't just justice for him. It was a message. A shift. A beginning. And for the first time since that night, Marcus breathed freely. He had won not just a lawsuit, but a battle for dignity. A battle for truth. A battle that would echo far beyond this moment. And as he walked down the courthouse steps with his mother beside him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The sunlight spilled across Marcus Hale's office like a benediction, warming the edges of the room that had once felt too cold, too suffocating. The lawsuit was over. $3.5 million delivered by the jury, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the affirmation, the recognition that even in a world stacked with bias, one person could stand and be seen for who he was. Not the color of his skin, not the title he held, just a human being wronged, demanding accountability. He sat behind his desk, the leather chair creaking slightly under his weight. On the wall, portraits of past senators stared down, faces frozen in time, reminders of the legacy he carried. His mother had come to the office that morning, beaming despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. She had insisted on being there the moment he walked in, like she needed to witness the triumph with her own eyes. And Marcus let her, not because he needed validation, but because her presence grounded him. Made him remember where he came from and why he fought. Alina arrived next. She closed the door softly behind her and leaned against the frame. Her eyes were gentle but wary, as if watching for the moment his newfound relief might crack and the memories of the night of his arrest would resurface. She didn't speak at first, she didn't need to. She just walked up to him, and together they sat in silence, the kind of silence that is filled with understanding rather than absence. Finally, she reached over and took his hand. "You're home," she said, voice tender but firm. Marcus looked at her, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt safe. Not untouchable, not invincible, just human, fragile, but still capable of standing tall. He squeezed her hand. "I am," he replied. "I am home." Damir's laughter echoed through the office when he appeared in the doorway, holding a small stack of colored paper and crayons. He had insisted on joining, even though he had school, even though the day had been long. "Daddy," he said, eyes wide, "look at my drawing." It was a rainbow with figures holding hands, Marcus in the middle, Alina on one side, Damir on the other. Even in a child's rough strokes, Marcus recognized the symbolism: family, unity, protection. A small but potent reminder of why he had endured so much. The senator leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. His mind replayed the moments of the trial, the cold, accusatory stare of Officer Riker, the silence that followed Jordan Vance's cross-examination, the gavel banging, announcing the verdict. Justice had been served, but more importantly, truth had been affirmed. And in that affirmation, Marcus felt something he had almost forgotten, the possibility that the system could bend, even if just slightly, toward fairness. In the weeks that followed, the lawsuit became a turning point. Headlines splashed across newspapers and online publications. State Senator wins landmark $3.5 million suit against officer, and justice for black men, Hale's victory signals change. People called, sent letters, and reached out online. Some shared stories similar to his own, stories of wrongful suspicion, humiliation, and silent endurance. And Marcus listened, every single one. He knew now that this victory was more than personal. It was communal. A testament to resilience, dignity, and the power of standing firm in the face of systemic bias. The money, though substantial, was secondary. Marcus and Alina decided to establish a foundation with a portion of the settlement, an initiative aimed at supporting victims of police misconduct, providing resources for legal assistance, counseling, and education. It was something concrete, a way to turn their ordeal into a force that could prevent others from enduring what he had. Damir even got involved, helping to name the foundation and design the logo. A small child's vision of hope and justice crystallized into reality. At home, life began to feel normal again, but richer. Not because the days were easier, the trauma didn't vanish overnight, but because each moment carried a deeper significance. Marcus noticed the small things, the way Alina's hand fit in his, the sound of Damir's laughter ringing through the house, the way morning sunlight streaked across the kitchen. He found gratitude in routine, in the ordinary, because he had seen how quickly it could be stripped away. Yet the memory of the arrest remained, sharp and visceral. He would replay it in his mind, feel the sting of humiliation, the surge of anger, the tremor of fear coursing through him. But instead of allowing it to dominate, he channeled it. Into speeches, into legislative efforts, into mentorship programs for young black men in the city, teaching them not only how to survive in a world that often misjudged them, but how to thrive despite it. His story became a touchstone, a living example that injustice could be confronted without losing one's dignity. One evening, after a long day of meetings and foundation planning, Marcus stood on the balcony of his apartment looking out over the city. The lights twinkled like stars, and for a moment he allowed himself to simply breathe. No strategy, no speeches, no press, just presence. Alina stood beside him, warm and steady, and Damir leaned against the railing, eyes shining with curiosity about the world he was growing into. The three of them together, framed against the urban horizon, a picture of endurance and love, of lives intertwined and strengthened by struggle. He reflected on Officer Riker, on the system, on all the ways the world had tried to diminish him. And he felt something remarkable, compassion. Not for the cruelty he had endured, not for the humiliation, but for the humanity in everyone, flawed, often misguided, but capable of change. He had seen it firsthand in the jury, in the courtroom, in the support that poured in afterward. He had seen it in himself. Marcus turned to Alina. "We're stronger than I ever imagined," he said quietly. "We always were," she replied, smiling. And it wasn't just comfort she offered, it was a recognition of his journey, of what they had all endured together. The days passed, one by one, stitched together with subtle victories. A call from a local school acknowledging his speech on justice, a young man writing to him about how the trial gave him courage to stand up, a neighbor thanking him for advocating for community safety. Each note, each conversation, each recognition was a thread weaving a tapestry of change. Small, perhaps imperceptible at first, but powerful in its accumulation. And Marcus never forgot that the largest impact of this ordeal wasn't in the courtroom or in the press. It was in the quiet moments, when Damir ran into his arms after school, when Alina laughed at a joke he had made, when he finally allowed himself to sleep through the night without waking in panic. The simplest moments carried the most profound proof. Life could continue. Life could thrive. Justice, in its own imperfect, human way, had opened a path forward. He thought of the countless men who didn't get the chance to be heard, who were dismissed, ignored, or worse. The memory stung. It wasn't enough that he had won. He owed it to them to turn his story into action. And so every day, in every meeting, every speech, every policy decision, he carried their voices with him. The trial had changed him, hardened him in the right ways, softened him in the necessary ones. He had been stripped bare and rebuilt. Not by malice, not by hate, but by the enduring force of truth and perseverance. And then there was the rare, fleeting peace, a quiet morning when Marcus, Alina, and Damir sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast. The sunlight poured through the window, and the world outside felt suspended in serenity. Marcus watched his son's small hands, fingers smeared with orange juice and toast crumbs, and felt a surge of protection so intense it was almost sacred. Alina brushed a lock of hair from her face, smiling at both of them. And in that instant, the weight of the ordeal lifted just enough for him to feel it, the promise of tomorrow. That hope could exist even after injustice. That life, though fragile and sometimes cruel, was beautiful and resilient. The story of the arrest, the trial, the lawsuit, it would always be a part of him. But it no longer controlled him. Marcus had turned the worst night of his life into a catalyst for change, a lesson in strength, dignity, and the power of truth. He had transformed humiliation into advocacy, fear into courage, despair into action. The echoes of that night would remain, yes, but now they resonated differently, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what could be overcome. And as he watched Damir chase a stray butterfly across the yard, Alina calling after him with a laugh, Marcus Hale felt, at last, the full weight and grace of victory. Not just personal victory, but the kind that ripples outward, quiet, steady, and unstoppable. Justice had been served, truth had been honored, and dignity had been reclaimed. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let himself feel it fully. The relief, the affirmation, the lightness of a life reclaimed. The journey was far from over, but the first battle had been won. And in that victory, Marcus realized something essential. Resilience was more than endurance. It was transformation. And through that transformation, he had become not only a survivor, but a force for change. Justice is not always swift. It is not always easy. Sometimes it comes wrapped in fear, humiliation, and doubt. But it is never meaningless. Marcus Hale's story reminds us that even in the face of systemic injustice, even when the world tries to reduce us to a single stereotype, a single mistake, a single assumption, truth has power. Dignity has weight. Courage has consequence. He could have let that night define him, let the fear and the anger fester into bitterness. But instead he stood. He spoke. He acted, not just for himself, but for every man, every woman, every child who had ever been told that their skin, their presence, their very existence made them a suspect. Marcus transformed injustice into accountability, humiliation into hope, and fear into a movement. That is the essence of strength, not physical, not loud, but moral and unshakable. This story is a reminder that power does not always reside in uniforms, in money, or in titles. True power lives in those who refuse to accept lies as truth, who demand that the system see them as human beings first. And even when society's institutions falter, the courage to stand, to insist on accountability, to pursue justice, can spark change that echoes far beyond a single verdict, far beyond one courtroom. Marcus's journey is also about resilience in its quiet, human form. It is in the morning laughter of a child, in the tender touch of a loved one, in the decision to take pain and turn it into purpose. Change is not always public. Sometimes it is private, hidden in the decisions we make every day to act with integrity, empathy, and persistence. It is in standing up, again and again, even when the odds are stacked against us. If this story touches you, remember, injustice anywhere is a call to courage. Dignity is non-negotiable. Truth can be louder than oppression, stronger than fear, and brighter than hatred. Stand, speak, act, not for fame, not for reward, but because the world needs people willing to transform pain into progress. That is the legacy Marcus Hale leaves behind. Proof that justice, however delayed, is never denied to those who refuse to surrender their humanity. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to see that courage matters, that accountability matters, and that even in the darkest moments, the light of justice can shine.